Kashi Delay, and welcome to Tibet Talks. I'm Ashwin Verghese of the International Campaign for Tibet. Thank you for joining us on today's show. When we talk about saving Tibet, it's not just because Tibetans, like all people, deserve to live in basic human dignity and freedom. It's also because the Tibetan people have an enormous amount to contribute to the society and the culture of our world. Pema Tseden was a brilliant Tibetan director, screenwriter, and author. Through arresting, involving films like Tharlo, Old Dog, and The Silent Holy Stones, he showed the world a look into life inside Tibet, seen through the eyes of a Tibetan himself, a rare and remarkable feat under the censorious rule of the Chinese Communist regime. In more ways than one, Pema Tseden was a trailblazer. And yet, as we'll hear later in our conversation with Tenzin Sonam, one of the distinguishing features of Pema Tseden cinema is its preoccupation with the past. Specifically, the clash between the traditional way of life of the Tibetan people and the soulless modernity foisted on them by the government of Beijing. Unfortunately, Pema Tseden died tragically last month at the age of just 53. Therefore, we will not get to see what this visionary director, still in the prime of his creative life, would have done in the future. But Pema Tseden left behind a vital artistic legacy, including by encouraging and inspiring other Tibetans inside Tibet to find their own voice as cinema makers. We will discuss all of that on today's episode of Tibet Talks with our guest, the Tibetan exile filmmaker Tenzin Sonam. But first, I am pleased to introduce a new segment of the show. As our longtime audience knows, Tibet Talks was primarily hosted by Tencho Gyatso, my ICT colleague. But a few months ago, Tencho was elevated to the position of ICT president, a well-deserved and widely celebrated honor. With Tencho now the leader of the organization, I wanted to check in with her so she could provide all of our followers here on Tibet Talks with an update about what's happening at the organization and in the wider Tibet movement. Therefore, I sat down with Tencho earlier this week for a chat with the ICT president. Let's hear what she had to say. So I'm speaking to you on the morning of Monday, June 12th, and we just wrapped up a very exciting week here at ICT. Can you tell our audience about that?
Yes, we just wrapped up last week our Tibetan Youth Leadership Program. We had 9 youth undergrad and grad students from across the United States here, and we had a packed week of programs with them, showing them how ICT operates, showing meetings for them with their congressional officers, with the State Department, the Office of Undersecretary Zaya, who is the Special Coordinator for Tibetan Affairs, and with Ambassador Rashad Hussain, who is the International Religious Freedom Ambassador at the State Department. So the youth got a chance to learn firsthand how policy is shaped in DC and how we operate here in Washington. So it was busy, but we had a good time with them, and you had a session with them as well.
I did, yeah. It was a lot of fun. It was great to see these young Tibetan Americans come here and get the opportunity to learn about the policy-making process, like Tencho mentioned. I think they had a lot of fun getting to see the nation's capital as well. So it was kind of a good time all around, a lot of work, like Tencho said, but a big program here at ICT, so we're very happy that went off well. Before TYLP, I know you've been traveling a lot since you took over as president of ICT. You were in New York recently and you met with other ICT leaders. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, one of the things I wanted to do was to meet with our colleagues in person. So we had the executive directors of our office in Germany, Mr. Kai Müller, and the executive director of our offices in Amsterdam and Brussels, Mr. Wong Putethong, and Bujun Sirila, who heads now our research and monitoring unit here. 4 of us in New York. We met with our ICT chairman, Mr. Richard Gear, chairman of the board of directors of ICT, Mr. Richard Gear, and Mr. Pema Tseden, who's also a board member, to advise us on what we should be looking at the weeks ahead, and also to kind of coordinate the works that we do in our different offices. So we met there. We had 2 full days of meetings.
And you mentioned Buchongla, and I do want to throw in here too that we also had a very exciting day for him last week when he received an honor from the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. He received the Truman Reagan Medal of Freedom, which is a great reflection on him personally and as well on the Tibet movement. Shimura, you want to share your congratulations for Buchong and receiving the award?
Yes, we were very proud and happy to see Buchongla recognized at that event. I know personally from having worked over almost 15 years here at ICT very closely with Buchongla how his dedication, his wise counsel, his day and night it doesn't. He's there working on these issues. So we felt proud to be part of this event recognizing Buchongla and the work of ICT and the work of Tibet and the Tibetan struggle, the Tibetan people in general. So I think this award means a lot for us Tibetans as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a great day and we were all very excited to be there to celebrate with Buchongla. And so Tencho, we talked a little bit about what's been happening the last few weeks. As we look ahead, next month will also be a busy month. We have His Holiness's upcoming 88th birthday, which is a huge source of excitement for all of us. Can you talk to us a little bit about what's kind of coming up for ICT?
Yes, we have, as you said, we're just in the middle of organizing the birthday event. We normally do that in coordination with the Office of Tibet, Representative Namgyal, and the local Tibetan community, the Capital Area Tibetan Association. So July 6th, we'll have an event, and we hope our special coordinator, Undersecretary Zaya, will be attending that, as well as other dignitaries and guests. So we'll be sharing more as we get closer to it.
Lastly, Tencho, any other messages that you'd like our Tibet Talk audience to know?
No, thank you. Please share with us if you have thoughts on what you would like to hear from us in our Tibet Talks, as well as in the work we do. And we're able to do all this work with the support and generosity of ICP members all around. So really thank you for your support.
And Joe, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Ashwin. Thank you.
My thanks to my colleague, ICT President Tencho Gyatso, for sitting down with me earlier this week for that discussion. I hope you all enjoyed hearing, once again, from our original host here on Tibet Talks, and we promise to check back in with Tencho on future episodes of the program. But for now, let's get back to the main topic of today's show. As I mentioned, we are here today to explore the legacy of the luminous Tibetan filmmaker, Pema Tseden. Let me give you some background details about this great director, who again passed away last month at the age of 53. Pema Tseden was born 1969 in the traditional Tibetan region of Amdo. Though he worked early on as a teacher and a civil servant, in the early 1990s, he began publishing short stories set in Tibet, written in both the Tibetan and Chinese languages. According to the New York Times, these stories, quote, depicted individuals confronted with sweeping changes, a theme that Pema Tseden would return to in his film work. In the early 2000s, Pema Tseden attended China's premier film school, the Beijing Film Academy, of which he was the first Tibetan graduate. In 2005, his debut movie, The Silent Holy Stones, reportedly made him the first Tibetan filmmaker in the PRC to shoot a feature film entirely in the Tibetan language. The movie also earned Pema Tseden the Best Directorial Debut at China's 25th Golden Rooster Awards. His follow-up feature, 2009's The Search, or Soul Searching, won the Special Jury Award at the 12th Shanghai International Film Festival. In 2011, Pema Tseden released Old Dog, which won Best Narrative Feature at the 2012 Brooklyn Film Festival, and broke new ground in his career as arguably his first movie with a clear narrative arc. It was also arguably his angriest film to date, which perhaps reflected the deteriorating situation in Tibet in the early 2010s. Pema Tseden's next feature, Darlo, from 2015, was also despairing, and it raised Pema Tseden's status to an even higher level in the world of global cinema. The film premiered at the Venice Film Festival, one of the top film festivals in the entire world, and it was nominated for the festival's coveted Golden Lion Prize. Pema Tseden received further acclaim for the films Jimpa in 2018 and Balloon the following year. At the time of his passing, he was reportedly working on several other projects. But my describing Pema Tseden's filmography hardly does it justice. For that, you have to watch his movies yourself. And I highly encourage all of you who are watching or listening to this program to look up Pema Tseden's films on your own. You might be able to borrow them from your local library, or you can stream them online. So please do check them out. But for now, we want to share with you a brief highlight reel from 3 of Pema Tseden's films, Darlo, Jimpa, and Balloon. For those of you who are listening to this episode of Tibet Talks as a podcast, you can find the video on the YouTube channel of the International Campaign for Tibet. And for those of you who are watching live, let's take a look right now.
Tenzin Sonam是刚才讲的，大家就这个样。저도 그나 도통로 처음에 엄청 강내 됐다. 나.
Shunga sasajaginya damda. Chakaro nyashi gyati jare.
Dakuri zintili, anari.
I hope you could tell from that clip what an incredible visual stylist and visual storyteller Pema Tseden was. But the best way to understand one great filmmaker is to hear from another great filmmaker. And on today's episode of Tibet Talks, we are fortunate to speak with Tenzin Sonam, a Tibetan filmmaker based in exile. In tandem with his partner, Ritu Saran, and their production company, White Crane Films, Tenzin Sonam has made over 20 documentaries, several video installations, and 2 dramatic features, including the pair's superb 2018 film, The Sweet Requiem, which screened right here in Washington, D.C. a few years ago. A recurring subject in the pair's work is the issue of Tibet, which they have been intrinsically and intimately involved with, personally, politically, and artistically. They are also the directors of the Dharamsala International Film Festival, based in the Tibetan exile capital, of Dharamsala, India, which is one of India's leading independent film festivals. After Pema Tseden's death last month, Tenzin Sonam shared on Twitter an essay he had written analyzing Pema Tseden's work. It is an excellent and insightful essay, and we will include the link to read it in the comment section of our Facebook Live post and in our podcast notes. So please check that out. In the meantime, Tenzin Sonam was kind enough to speak to me last week about Pema Tseden. Let's listen to that conversation now. Tenzin Sonam La, Tashi Delay, thank you so much for being with us and welcome to Tibet Talks.
Tashi Delay, Ashwin, thank you for having me.
We really appreciate you being here. I wish we were kind of meeting under better circumstances, but today we are here to talk about the memory of Pema Tseden, a great Tibetan filmmaker. So it's an honor for us to be joined by another great Tibetan filmmaker. So thank you for being part of this conversation. So I wanted to ask you here, just to start out with, so we want to try to kind of understand the filmography of the Pema Tseden. And it seems to me that a lot of great filmmakers, they tend to focus on some of the same themes over and over in their work. For example, Martin Scorsese, the director of Kundun, has made a number of films about great religious figures like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Jesus Christ, others. On the thematic level, what were Pema Tseden's films about?
I think Pema Tseden, almost without exception, dealt with the conflict between modernity and tradition as it was playing out in Tibet. And I think this was a subject that was very close to him. He observed the changes that were taking place in his homeland, in Amdo. Being from a kind of a nomadic pastoral background himself, he was very close to the changes that were taking place. And I think he could see that traditions in Tibet, language, the folk culture, religious practice, these were all kind of changing very quickly, very rapidly and dramatically with uncertain kind of results. And this was something that he kind of focused on keenly right from his very first film.
Thank you for sharing that. So it's good to get that kind of introduction to the subject matter that he liked to deal with. Now let's talk about Pema Tseden's style and technique. So as I mentioned, you are a great filmmaker yourself. As a director, what can you tell us about Pema Tseden's style and technique in his own films?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Pema Tseden was, he was a very rigorous and conceptual filmmaker. I think he thought through how he was going to employ the cinema language for each of the films he was going to make, for the stories that he was going to tell. And he was very kind of disciplined in the way that he was, going to make his films. He thought through every aspect of how he would compose a shot, how he would edit his films. I mean, his films are highlighted by, for instance, long takes. He often shot films, with very long takes. For instance, the opening sequence in Tharlo, one of his later films, I think runs almost 10 minutes without a cut, and it's the main character just standing in front of the camera reciting Chairman Mao's quotations. But for those 10 minutes, you're kind of held by what's happening on screen. And this was something he did constantly throughout his career. Long takes. He also kind of used very few close-ups. He didn't like to use close-ups. He preferred to shoot scenes in long shots, which means to keep the characters quite far away from the camera. And he did that deliberately, I think, to kind of create a sense of alienation that the characters were facing, maybe with their environment, with their landscape. He also didn't use many conventional cinema techniques. For instance, normally when you shoot a conversation between two characters, you would have a back and forth kind of a cutting rhythm. You'd have character A talking, you'd cut to character B, like listening or responding. But Pema Tseden would always shoot conversations in one frame, both characters in the frame, long takes, like, where they would just talk to each other. So these were some of the hallmarks of Pema Pema Tseden's stylistic kind of choices. And I think in doing that, he carved out for himself a very specific kind of a style for himself, one that was immediately recognizable, so that, in the international kind of cinema, forum, Pema Tseden's films were recognized as being distinctly Pema Tseden's films, which is saying quite a lot, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. I saw Thorlo a few years ago, and I was struck by the opening shot that you mentioned. But it's very interesting to hear it in that context about kind of what he was saying by filming that scene in that way. So thanks for mentioning that. So recently, after Pema Tseden unfortunately passed away, I saw on Twitter you shared a piece that you had written about him. I think it was quite a few years ago, maybe in 2011. But you wrote about kind of discovering his films and his first movie, The Silent Holy Stones. You write that, because of China's occupation of Tibet and the way that censorship works in Tibet under Chinese rule, you kind of instinctively, you say, quote, "I instinctively expected a film that would at best present a rosy picture of life in Tibet and at worst be out and out propaganda." A very understandable response, of course. However, once you actually saw the film, you said it was a surprise, it was a revelation. Can you talk to us about that experience of discovering Pema Tseden as a filmmaker and watching The Silent Holy Stones for the first time?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to remember that I grew up in exile. And for the longest time, Tibetans who grew up in exile did not have a direct connection with Tibet. And we were kind of, I don't want to use the word brainwashed, but we were certainly kind of led to believe that the situation in Tibet was really terrible, which it is, but to the extent that Tibetan culture, language, its traditions and practices were under threat, and that we, who were living in exile, were kind of the upholders or the keepers of traditional Tibetan values and, the whole culture. That was kind of, the mindset that I think Tibetans in exile grew up under. So for us to kind of imagine that in Tibet, there could be the possibility, especially in filmmaking, which is such a specialized kind of a field, which requires, teamwork, it requires like funding, it requires, expertise, that suddenly a film would come out of Tibet. And I first heard about Pema Tseden's The Silent Holy Stones, reading about it, I think when it was opening at the Busan International Film Festival in South Korea. And Busan is one of the most prestigious film festivals in Asia and in the world, actually. So to suddenly, and the film was being promoted heavily, no doubt by the Chinese government as well, as the first Tibetan, feature film. And it was like, wow, what is this? How did a Tibetan, filmmaker suddenly emerge out of, at least in my mind, out of nowhere, as a film at Busan, which means it's obviously of a certain standard. And, having that kind of bias that, or the prejudice that we exiled Tibetans grew up, feeling, or the sense of superiority, a complete misplaced sense of superiority that we felt, that this could not be possible, Part of it was also because Pema Tseden, when he made The Silent Holy Stones, spelt his name in the Chinese kind of style. So it was Wanma Saidan, which is an approximation of the way his name is pronounced in Amdo. So it was, to me, it was like, okay, well, he must be like, a Chinese sort of, somebody that the Chinese have like sort of, pushed up. So when I saw the film in New York, actually, I was just completely taken aback, really like literally blown away, because it was really the first authentic Tibetan film that I had seen from Tibet. In fact, there were hardly any Tibetan films made by Tibetan filmmakers anywhere, whether in Tibet or in exile, that told, a story of ordinary Tibetans, leading ordinary lives in Tibet, facing problems that were also very human and universal, all done in a way that was beautifully expressed, in terms of its filmmaking. That really took me by surprise. I was very, very interested then to find out more about Pema Tseden. And of course, then I learned that not only was he a filmmaker, he was actually a writer, a novelist, a short story writer, writing in both Tibetan and in Chinese, which is a very rare thing. So, yeah, the more I discovered about him and the more films that he then started making and that I started watching, the more I realized that here was a truly genuine, artist who had come out of Tibet. And that's how it was.
Well, yeah, and thank you for mentioning that. You kind of touched on this a little bit, but I did want to get a little bit more into, as you mentioned, you have lived your whole life in exile from Tibet. And, as a person, many people in our audience are Tibetans in exile. And I'm just curious, what did it mean to you to see, not just the Silent Holy Stones, but other films by Pema Tseden that were set in your ancestral land? And film is a unique medium in that sense, and that it is different than reading literature, which is a wonderful experience too, but to actually be able to see it with your own eyes and see the people and see the landscapes. What was that experience like for you as somebody you've never been able to go to Tibet, right? So what was that experience like for you?
Yeah, I think the difference between, say, cinema and literature is that cinema kind of holds a mirror up to, a people's kind of lived experiences. And to see yourself depicted on the screen, it's a very powerful thing, and so absolutely to see Tibetan stories from Tibet, particularly from Amdo, which is where my father's from as well. Very human stories that normally we don't get to hear about in exile. Stories of, nomads, farmers, pastoralists, the kind of problems and difficulties and sort of moral kind of conflicts that they were facing in the face of this kind of relentless modernization, this relentless sort of influence that was kind of creeping in from the outside over which they have no control. I think that was something really special to see that. Also, I have to state or mention at this stage that I understood very clearly that Pema Tseden did not have the freedom to tackle all the subjects that he might well have wanted to, because of course of the political kind of situation in Tibet, the censorship, the repression that's ongoing, the attempt by the Chinese authorities to kind of to control the expression of ethnic identity, as it were. So all these things were playing against Pema Tseden. So for him to then find a way to navigate the controls that authorities were imposing upon him, and yet be able to tell stories that rang true, that were kind of honest, that were things that he wanted to express and talk about, I think that's something that's quite remarkable, something very exceptional that he managed to achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've mentioned a few of his films here so far. We've talked about The Silent Holy Stones. You mentioned Tharlo, a movie that I greatly enjoyed. For members of our audience who haven't had the opportunity to see more of his films, and they are accessible in the United States. It might be a little bit hard sometimes for people to find them exactly where they are, but you can watch his movies here. For people who aren't as familiar with some of those other movies, can you kind of talk us through a few of them, and what are some titles that, if somebody is just approaching the cinema of Pema Tseden for the first time, what are some movies that they can maybe start with?
Yeah, I think The Silent Holy Stones is a good start to Pema Tseden, because it's perhaps in some ways the most accessible or the simplest of his films in terms of its storytelling. It's also kind of has a sense of optimism in the film, in that it kind of still holds some faith in the strength or the resilience of traditional Tibetan culture to overcome, whatever obstacles these changes from the outside are imposing upon the people there. That's a good one to start with. I would also highly recommend Old Dog, which I think was the third film that he made, after The Silent Holy Stones. It was the first film in which Pema Tseden, prior to Old Dog, he had been quite careful in how he set his stories. So, for instance, in The Silent Holy Stones and his second film, The Search, there's an absence of Chinese characters. You don't see Chinese people at all. You hardly even kind of sense that all these big momentous changes that are kind of taking place are originating because of, the Chinese kind of occupation of Tibet. It's seen more as, a universal kind of, a universal paradigm that's taking place. People everywhere are undergoing these kind of changes. But in Old Dog, you sense a visceral kind of an anger that's in the film that comes across. And it's also the first Pema Tseden film that has a definite narrative arc. It's got, a key character. It's got conflicts in the traditional sense of, what is, happening, who the victims are, who the villain is, in a sense, and what's at stake. And it has a denouement, a very dramatic denouement that plays out at the end. It's a beautiful film, and I think it captures so many things about what's happening in Tibet today, without sort of casting blame or. I mean, it does cast some blame on the rise of sort of say the Chinese upper middle classes and their craze for all things Tibetan, including the Tibetan nomad mastiff dog, which is at the center of the conflict in the film. But at the same time, it's not blaming. It's not a political statement, but yet it captures so evocatively the crossroads that Tibetans find themselves in at this moment in their history. So that's a film I would highly recommend. And of course, I think Tharlo is the third film that people should watch. It's perhaps Pema Tseden's best film in terms of both the cinematic language that he employs to tell the story. It's a film that's shot starkly in black and white. It's got a very sympathetic leading character. It's got it sucks you into its tale, a story, and at the end it kind of spits you out, feeling everything that the character has gone through, which is not very optimistic. So yes, those three films maybe would be good places to start.
I definitely concur with you on Darlo. The black and white imagery is absolutely beautiful, breathtaking. The main actor, I don't know, I believe he was a non-professional as well, and it's just captivating to watch, So he was incredible.
I think he is quite a well-known comedian and an actor. Sorry. So I think he was actually the only kind of person who had some professional experience. Right. In the film, but the others were all non-professionals. Yeah, sure, and of course, Pema Tseden throughout his filmmaking career used non-professionals a lot. So you're not wrong in thinking that.
Yeah, generally, right? Yeah, and and you're right, absolutely. By the end, it's a very emotionally involving experience. And Old Dog, I had the opportunity to watch that after Pema Tseden passed away. I went and watched it for the first time, and again, just incredible, sort of an allegory for what's happening in Tibet, and really just something that I would encourage everybody in our audience to watch, just to sort of understand what the emotional experience is like for Tibetans in Tibet. So an incredible movie. As I mentioned, you yourself, of course, are an accomplished filmmaker. You and your partner, Ritu, have made several films. We had a screening of one of your movies here in Washington a few years ago, where I had the chance to meet you in person. And I'm just curious. I know you're sort of a contemporary in the sense of Pema Tseden, but did he influence you in your own work as a director?
I mean, that's a hard question to answer. I mean, when Pema Tseden made his first film, of course, Ritu and I had already made several films. We had also made our first Tibetan feature film, set in exile. So I think in some ways our stylistic kind of path was quite different from Pema Tseden's, and so in that sense I don't think there's an overlap in terms of the kinds of films that we were making. And that's, of course, also totally, understandable because Pema Tseden grew up in Tibet. His cinematic influences were primarily derived from his stay or his education at the Beijing Film Academy, the premier kind of film academy in China, where he had access to, a lot of international world cinema, but of course also the Chinese cinematic tradition that is, has a long tradition in China, unlike, say, in Exile, where we kind of were adrift, not connected to our homeland, more concerned about questions of identity, about, homeland. Politics played a big role in our concerns, all things that are kind of, different from Pema Tseden's concerns. So I think in terms of influence, I don't think there was any influence in that sense, but certainly I respected him hugely for what he accomplished, for the legacy he's left behind, and enormous respect for what he's done.
Yeah, and that kind of segues well to the next question that I wanted to ask, which is that, Pema Tseden is probably the most well-known filmmaker from Tibet, and he did have a lot of success in international film festivals, was known, got reviews in Hollywood publications and things like that. But he was sort of a trailblazer, but there have been other film artists who have come in following him. I'm curious now, obviously, we've lost sort of maybe the best known name from the Tibetan film industry. But I'm curious, as we kind of reflect on his legacy and where we are now, can you talk a little bit about the state of other Tibetan filmmakers? And, are there other people who are able to kind of carry on his legacy?
Yeah, that's a really good question because from what I have understood, one of Pema Tseden's kind of concerns when he started out as a filmmaker was the fact that there were no Tibetan filmmakers in Tibet telling Tibetan stories. And he set out very, very definitely to challenge the kind of exoticized depiction of Tibet that even Chinese filmmakers were, coming out with. He said on several occasions in several interviews that he felt his job was, as a Tibetan, to be the mouthpiece, the eyes, the conscience of what Tibetan people were going through, that only Tibetans could tell authentic Tibetan stories. And part of this mission that he kind of set out for himself was to create a kind of an infrastructure where Tibetans could then, not just him, but other Tibetans could also, be empowered to tell their own stories on film. And in order to do this, right from the beginning, he enlisted, many young Tibetans to work for him in different capacities. His cameraman in his first films was Suntar Gyal, who actually also studied at the Beijing Film Academy. And Suntar Gyal then went on to make his own films successfully, had them shown in international film festivals. There's a whole generation of younger Tibetans that, Pema Tseden has directly influenced, if not actually mentored, who are now taking up the baton, as it were. And there's Lapel Gyal, there's Pema Tseden's old son, Jigme, who's also, making his first film. There's Kashem Gyal. So there's a whole group of young filmmakers, especially in Amdo, that are already there. I think that's the legacy that Pema Tseden left behind. He left behind, he forged the path, and he created a kind of an ecosystem for Tibetans to be able to follow him. And he's done that so successfully because, even though it's such a great loss that, he's no longer there, he's made sure that there are people, who will carry on his legacy. And I feel also that his influence transcended, just the Amdo region of Tibet, where he's from, even though the majority of his films were in the Amdo language. But he recognized that to be a Tibetan filmmaker or to talk about Tibetan films, one had to go beyond, these kind of provincial sort of boundaries. And in fact, he was, I think, making he was planning to make a couple of films, one in Kham and one in Uchang in central Tibet. So he realized that, he had to go beyond just Amdo. And in that sense, I think he did influence filmmakers from these other parts of Tibet as well. So, as far as I'm concerned, I think Tibetan filmmaking is now at a stage in Tibet where it can go on to, sort of perpetuate itself. But of course, it all depends on the vagaries of, the political system in China and how much freedom is allowed to these filmmakers.
Yeah, thank you for that. Before we go, I do have to ask you yourself. As I mentioned, we saw your film, The Street Requiem, here in Washington, and are there any other projects that you and Ritu are working on that you might be able to share with us, or can you kind of give us an update on what's going on with you two as filmmakers?
Yeah, sure. So we are slated to shoot a short Tibetan film later this year. It's going to be part of an omnibus of 5 Tibetan films by 5 Tibetan filmmakers, and it's been initiated by Trung Tibetan Filmmakers Collective in Dharamsala, a collective of young Tibetan filmmakers. So I think that's very exciting for me personally because, 5 of us, very different filmmakers, are going to come together to sort of reflect on the questions of exile, of, statelessness, of identity in 5 short films, which will then be presented as one omnibus film. So that's slated for later this year. But Ritu and I have been, working on this long-term project, which is actually an archive-based exhibition project called Shadow Circus, a personal archive of Tibetan resistance. And it kind of is an exhibition based on the archives of my father, who was very involved in the Tibetan resistance and particularly in its liaison with the CIA, the archives he maintained. And then the research that Ritu and I did on the Tibetan resistance, including the CIA's involvement, tracking down former CIA agents and talking to them, interviewing them. So this exhibition has started out in Berlin 3 years ago as part of the Berlin Film Festival and has since shown in Delhi and recently at the Kochi Biennale. And it will now show in a gallery in Bombay, and then next year in the Mannheim Photo Biennale in Germany. So this is a project that is very close to our heart, and it's something we dearly want to show in America because we think the subject is of such relevance to Americans, and so little known, this particular chapter of America's involvement in Tibet, that it would be great to, have an opportunity to show it there. So that's something that we're kind of actively working on at the moment.
Thank you for those very exciting projects, both of those. So it's very exciting to hear about that. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. We really, it's been great to talk to you about this, but we really even only kind of scratched the surface of Pema Tseden's work as a filmmaker and his importance as a filmmaker. Just one last question for you before we go. Are there any final words that you would like to share with our audience to kind of help people understand Pema Tseden's importance as a filmmaker?
Yeah, one thing I'd like to emphasize, I think, is that although Tibetans are rightly proud of Pema Tseden as being, the first Tibetan filmmaker to come out of Tibet and make a mark on the international, cinema stage, we should also remember that Pema Tseden is a true cinema auteur in the larger cinematic kind of universe. He forged a distinct identity for himself as a filmmaker, something that's really, difficult to achieve. So his kind of achievements or his fame rests not just upon the fact that he is a Tibetan filmmaker from Tibet, but that he is a genuine auteur, a filmmaker of great originality, who managed to bring Tibetan cinema, to the attention of the international audiences. And that, I think, is where his legacy is going to be the most kind of significant in the future.
Tenzin Sonam, thank you so much for joining us on Tibet Talks.
It was a pleasure, Ashwin. Thank you for having me.
My thanks again to Tenzin Sonam for joining me for that conversation about Pema Tseden. It was truly a treat to speak with one great Tibetan filmmaker to try to understand the work of another. But as I said during that conversation, we are only scratching the surface on the cinema of Pema Tseden. And the best way for you to truly understand the work of this Tibetan master is to seek out his films yourself and to watch them. And while you're doing that, please also check out the films of Tenzin Sonam and his partner, Ritu Seren. By seeing these movies, you can understand what Tibetans have to contribute to our understanding of our own world and our own lives, as well as why it's so important for all of us to work to preserve Tibetan culture and to protect Tibetans' freedom to express themselves artistically. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Tibet Talks. We will be back next month to celebrate the 88th birthday of His Holiness Dalai Lama, and we look forward to seeing you then. Until then, as we always say on the show, stay safe, stay well, and stay active. Thank you, and Tujache.